Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we'll talk about Entity Framework Core and Blazor Server, and actually this is a continuation for one of the most popular videos I would say here on the Code Wrinkles channel, which is called How to Use Entity Framework Core and in Blazor Server the right way. Now, the summary of what we have done there is that we have actually implemented the full CRUD operations on a Blazor server application using Entity Framework Core the right way. Now, I don't really want to get into details about what this actually means, because for that we have that video where I explain in depth what actually a circuit is, what problems we faced when using Entity Framework, or mainly the DB context, the way that we were used to work with it in regular MVC applications. So if you haven't watched that video and want to find out more, then please just pause this one and go to the other one. You'll find it in the description of this video or on a card here on the or in the corner upper right. So just go check that out. But the main thing that we have discussed there is actually that to use, or in my opinion, using Entity Framework Core in Blazor Server the right way actually means not adding or not using the DB context itself, but adding the DB context factory to the DI container, which adds actually for you an IDbContextFactory service that you can use to create context instances right when you need to use them, and of course then dispose them right when they are not used anymore. And that's actually very, very important. Now, this means that in our components, instead of injecting the DB context directly, we inject, as said, the IDbContextFactory. And there, for instance, if we go in this onInitialized async method, when we need to retrieve some data, we use the factory to create a DB context instance. We wrap everything in a using statement, of course. We do our job with the context, get the data that we need, and then right afterwards, when actually we are out of this using, the DB context will be disposed. And this is how you can ensure that you have really short-lived DB context instances, which is very important when it comes to Blazor server applications. And then further down, when we have this update method, once again, where we need a DB context, right at that point, we use the factory to create an instance. We do the job that we need to do with that DB context instance, wrap everything in a using statement, and of course, when the code execution exits this using statement, the DB context will be disposed. And working this way, you will really avoid a lot of headaches and concurrency errors that you might get from Entity Framework Core if you inject the DB context instead. Because this is a very simple application with very simple CRUD operations, but when you have more complex applications where you have several components on your screen, maybe in the layout, and in all of these components you use actually a DB context, when you load the application for the first time, all that components will actually try to use the exact same instance of your DB context to perform the work that they need to do. And that will result, of course, or most probably, in concurrency issues. And this is something that you really don't want to have. So you need to use the DbContextFactory. Now, there were a lot of comments to that video. Okay, this seems fair enough, but the code sample that I have provided, and you see actually right here, because it's exactly the same code that we have written during that video, is that okay, but probably you won't use neither the DB context or the DB context factory directly in your components, because most applications might have different service layers or even repositories. And then the common pattern in a layered architecture is that you might have repositories. So in that repository, you inject the DB context, and then you inject the repository in a service, and then you inject the service where you actually need to perform the work. So theoretically, it means that here we would need to inject a service instead of injecting directly the DB context factory. Now, other applications use a different approach, which is usually called CQRS. And there is this distinction between commands, queries, and then we have handlers for them. So each command or each query has its own handler. Now, how do we use the DB context in that case when we develop a Blazor server application? So what we want to do in this video right now is to actually take this code that we have written during the previous video and make it as friendly to a production-ready code as possible by adopting these different approaches with the layered architecture and the approach with CQRS. And for that, we'll implement two of the CRUD operations with services and repositories, and we'll implement the other two with CQRS so that we get an overall idea on how we can use this IDbContextFactory in conjunction with repositories and services, or in conjunction, of course, with this CQRS approach where we have commands, queries, and handlers for each of them. So let's get right into it. Of course, I have done a little bit of setup here. So first of all, what I have done, I have installed Mediator and I have added it to the dependency injection container. So that should work okay. We have the IDbContextFactory as we had previously, but here in the data, I have created a weather forecast repository, and we have here two methods that we'll actually have to implement. And I have here a weather forecast service. Now, of course, the idea is that what you would like to do is, well, we need to implement this pattern right now and try to actually see how things should work. Now, let's start with this one. And we'll start from the repository itself, because the repository is actually the part where you would need to inject the IDbContext. However, since this is a Blazor Server application, actually what we do is quite the same, but the only difference is that instead of injecting the IDbContext, we will inject here the IDbContextFactory, of course. Sorry for all this stuff here on the screen. So let's see this in work. So we'll have here private read only, and we'll have an IDbContextFactory, and let's call it just factory to be shorter. Okay, factory. And this is, of course, also like the regular IDbContext, a generic interface. So we have to provide a generic type parameter. And in our case, that would be the weather IDbContext. It should be this one. So we have this private field, and then we have this constructor here. So in the constructor, we'll inject the same thing like we have done, like we use in the, and we call this factory. And of course, in this constructor, we then just do the assignment. Sorry for that. It should be like this. Okay, so now we would be good to go. And now what we need to do here is actually exactly the same thing that we would do in our components right now. And let's have here, we have this get weather forecast by ID. And in this case, we have in this update component right now, we have in this on initialized async, and that's actually what we need. And what we can do is we can simply take this code from here, move it in the repository, and actually this should work. Now, the only thing, of course, is the factory in our case is the field. So this is the factory that will create us an instance. And then what we need to do here is we will have to return a forecast. Now, my Visual Studio plays a little bit crazy. So in this case, we just return await. And here the ID is this because it's not a property like it is. But here is get a weather forecast by ID. So we don't have to return an array. We just have to return a single item because it's get weather forecast by ID. And we are done with that. And this once again means that as soon as we have finished with this part, the IDbContext instance here gets disposed. And this ensures us that we have a really short-lived IDbContext instance. Now, the same thing for the update. We can go here in the update forecast component, and here in this task, we have this one. So we can just copy here the entire using part because that's actually what we need. Go back to our repository. And right now, of course, here we have to replace once again because this is our field is the factory, and we create the IDbContext instance, we update the forecast, we save the changes, and then that's it. The IDbContext instance, this one will get disposed right away when we finish with that. So this is actually the implementation for the repository. So nothing really problematic here. Now, if we go to the service here, usually the pattern is that you would inject repositories in your service and then use the service to perform stuff. Now, of course, in our case, it will be actually very, very simple. The service will just defer the responsibility to work with the data to the repository, and that would be it. But of course, in a real application, in a service, you would have much more logic than that, because this is the whole concept of having a service for that. Now, what we need to do here is we need to inject a private read-only, and we need to inject the weather forecast repository, and let's call this repo. And of course, the second thing that we'll need here is a constructor, and in the constructor, we need to pass in the exact same repository. So this is really dependency injection, how it's supposed to work in ASP.NET Core. So then here in this case, we just assign this and it would be okay. Now, the only thing here is in this first method, we have task of weather forecast because we want to get one by ID, and we'll just return repo, and we have this get weather forecast by ID. So we just need to pass in the ID to that, and that would be okay. Of course, we need also to await this, and of course, I should have named this get weather forecast by ID async, but once again, this video is not about how to use naming conventions. I just want to show you the main concept of how to use repositories and services in Blazor Server, once again, the right way, using the IDbContextFactory. Now, the repository is already using the IDbContextFactory, and the IDbContextFactory is injected directly into it. So we don't really have to care about this anymore in the service. We just defer this responsibility to the repository, and it will return us, here in this case, the weather forecast that has been created. Now, for the second one, what we need to do here is, of course, we need to update the forecast. So this would be also very, very, very simple. We will have here just await repo.update weather forecast, and that would be it. So we have right now the repository, we have right now the service. Now we kind of only need to wire everything up together so that it would work with dependency injection in ASP.NET Core, and therefore, of course, also in Blazor Server. So let's head back to our startup, and we can even add this as scoped right now. And we'll add first the weather forecast repository and services add scoped, and we'll add the weather forecast service. And that should actually do it. Right now, everything should be set up for dependency injection. Of course, I also have to type this correctly, and everything should work. Now, we can go right now in this update forecast component and do the necessary update so that we are using our service right now instead of the IDbContextFactory. And what we'll do here is we'll just use the service. So we'll inject the weather forecast service, and we'll call this forecast service. Okay, so we have injected it. Let's also keep to the naming that we had previously. So we have this forecast service that we inject right now. And that's actually all you need to do, because in the weather forecast service will be injected the repository, and in the repository will be injected the IDbContextFactory. This is how dependency injection works in ASP.NET Core, and therefore also, of course, in Blazor Server, since this is essentially ASP.NET Core. Now, the only thing that we would need to do here is we don't need this using anymore, because everything with the using and the IDbContext and the factory is handled by the repository. So here we actually just need the data. So we have here a forecast. It would be equal to a forecast service. And here we have this get weather forecast by ID. And we have to pass in the ID, which we get here from the routing. Okay, and of course we need to await this, since this is, and right now we should be good with that, so no problem. Now we should also go a little bit further down, and that's exactly the same thing that happens here. Instead of having this entire using, we will just have here await forecast service, and we'll have here this update weather forecast, and we can just provide the forecast that we have already in our component. Not sure, but yeah, it should be okay. So right now, this update part of the weather forecast works perfectly. So there should not be any problem with that. Let's run the application, because right now we should be able to actually update a forecast. So in the application, we should already have at least one entry, if I am not wrong. So let's just run it. Let's wait just a second, fetch data, because this is where we have implemented everything. And you see that here we get the data. We have only one weather forecast. So if we click on edit, we want to change here this temperature from 4 to 5 and update forecast. Everything worked fine. Even if we reload the page, we are still on the same page. So we see exactly the same things once again. So we have used right now the service, the weather forecast service, and we have injected a repository in the weather forecast service. And in the repository, once again, we have injected the IDbContextFactory. And in each method of the repository where we need to perform some operations with the database or with the DB-context, we just create an instance of the DB-context where we need it using the factory that gets disposed right after we don't need it anymore. And this is how you could implement this very, very, very easily in Blazor Server using this very, very standard, I would say, layered approach to developing an application. Now, let's go one step further and also try to cater for the other very popular approach where we use commands and handlers and queries and query handlers, of course. And to just not spend a lot of time of setting everything up, I have already registered mediator, but we have also already created some queries like get all forecast query. In this case, it will just return a weather forecast array. We don't need any type of parameters here. Now, the only thing is that we need, of course, to implement the handler for that. So let's go over to the handlers folder, and here we have this get all forecast query handler. And this is where all the magic needs to happen. So this would be the place where we would also need to use the DB context. And as it is appropriate when developing on Blazor Server, instead of using the DB context, I would use the IDbContextFactory. I would also need to add the using for that, and that is weather forecast, where it is DB context, that's one, and let's call this factory. Okay, and then of course we need the constructor, and in the constructor we'll pass in the exact same thing. So once again, the DI system will take care of this in our application. It's nothing really complicated, we just have to assign it. And here is where we actually need to perform the magic. So we have async task of weather forecast. Now, if we go to the fetch data component, which is where we actually get all the data, what we need to do is actually we need to use this using. So let's remove it from there, and let's go back to get all forecast query handler. And instead of throwing here a not implemented exception, of course, here we have the factory, and instead of assigning it, we just return that. So everything should be set up right now. Now the same thing, maybe we'll just copy this part here, because we have to go over to the command handler, which is supposed to create a new weather forecast, and we need to do exactly the same things. Of course, here we'll also need the usings for that. So Microsoft Entity Framework Core, then we need the constructor, and in the constructor factory, but of course we need to pass it also here. So let me just do that very quick. So in this case, we have factory equals, of course, we need to also provide a name for this parameter. So it would be factory. So that would be it. Of course, we need a semicolon here, not anything else. And of course, not the field, but sorry for this naming. IntelliSense this time tricked me a little bit, but right now we should be good to go once again. And if we go to this create a forecast component, which is where we actually use this, is this very simple method. Now, the only thing that we can do here is let's take this navigation out of the using, because we want to do the navigation after we have performed the work. And we can simply take this away from here, go back to our create forecast command handler. And of course, we need to make this async first. And in this case, we will just have this. Right now, we need factory. We have it in our field, create IDbContext. That one should be good to go. And here, not the forecast, but we need to have the forecast in a create forecast command. And we actually need to have it here. Don't we have it here? Let me, okay, we have it, forecast. Okay, we have to mark it public. Sorry for that. So now it's public. We shouldn't have a problem with that. Once again, request.forecast. Now we have it. So we edit, we save the changes, and we should be good to go. Now we also need to return the forecast that was already created. And well, then outside the using, of course, after we finish everything, we just return request forecast. But theoretically, since this is a reference type, when Entity Framework Core saves the changes, it would automatically also get an ID, and theoretically this ID should then be accessible. However, if we go to the create forecast component, we actually don't need this, because we just want to redirect then to the fetch data to get the entire table. So the only thing that we would need to do here is, of course, instead of injecting the IDbContextFactory, in this case, we will inject the IMediator. And let's call this mediator. So this is what we need to inject. We need also a using mediator for that. And right now we should be good to go with that. Now, what would happen here is that, of course, we would need to create a query. This is for the create. So we are on the create. We then have to also go to the fetch data, but let's create it now. So we need a command var command equals new create forecast command. Okay, it already sees that, or no, it doesn't see it, but I should be able to add the using at the top, and we should be good to go. Now, the only thing that I would like to do here is I would like to use a collection, or sorry, an object initializer, and say that the forecast, how is our variable called, is the forecast. So that is the one. Cool, we have that. So we should be good to go. Now, the next thing that we need to do is simply await mediator.send, and we just pass in the command. And once everything is completed, we just redirect to the fetch data. Now, let's go over to the fetch data, which displays the list that we have. And let's do the same things also here. Here we have a place here. Now, once again, instead of injecting the IDbContextFactory, we inject the IMediator. Would be something like that. I would, of course, also need to add the using for that, which is using mediator, and that should be fine right now. So here in this component, we have, well, this with try catch, and we have this data loading set to true or false to display something while the data loads. So yeah, here what we want to do is actually, here is where we need to implement stuff. So here we have our query equals new get all forecasts query. I guess that was the name for the query. Just 1 second, and IntelliSense will be able to help out. Of course, that's exactly what we needed. So what we can simply do here is we have these forecasts and say forecasts equals await mediator send, and we send in the query. And mediator will know exactly which handler to execute and get us the data that we would need. And theoretically, right now we should be good to go. We have to delete. Okay, we haven't actually implemented the delete for now. You know what? Actually, you know that it works quite the same. We could either use the service, or we could either use the approach with the delete command, and then with the delete command handler, of course. But you know what? Let's just comment it out, because I guess that the scope of this video is actually more or less achieved. Like, we are now able to use both the approach with the services with the IDbContextFactory, and we also know how to use CQRS and mediator, once again with the same approach of using a IDbContextFactory. Now, the only thing here is that we don't have here this on click. So we'll also just remove this part, and theoretically we should be good to go with it. Of course, the delete button will not work, but that's actually not a very big concern right now. So let me just run the application again. And theoretically right now, when we fetch the data, so when we go on the fetch data page, we already use CQRS. So we will use this get all query, and the handler for that query will be executed, and it will actually get us the data. We see that it's loading right now, and right now we have the data. Now, when we create an entry, and this one is month, then today is 14th, and 2021. Right now we have something like 2 degrees Celsius here, and summary, cold evening. And let's create forecast, and we see that it was created and we have it here. And if we want to edit it, we can, for instance, change this to 3, and we know that the update goes through the service. It is not through a handler, but it's still here, so everything works fine. So bottom line, as a summary, what we have achieved right now, we have actually departed from the point where we were using the IDbContextFactory in our Blazor server component. And then we wanted to transition and to move to a more, I would say, production-ready approach. And we have taken into consideration 2 different situations or scenarios. The first one, maybe the most popular, is where you would use a repository and a service. And the main pattern is that you would inject the DB context in the repository and the repository in the service, and then use the service whenever you need to perform something. Now, in this case, the pattern is actually the same. The only difference is, of course, that in the repository, instead of injecting the DB context, we inject the IDbContextFactory, and in each or at each point where we need to perform something with a DB context, we just use or create a new instance of the DB context in that place, wrap it in a using statement, and make sure that it gets disposed at the end. And then if you go for the approach with the handlers, the whole magic actually happens in the handlers in that case. So let's go here in this handler. It's the same thing. In the handler, instead of injecting the DB context, we inject the IDbContextFactory, and where we need to perform something with the DB context, we create ourselves an instance. We perform the work that we need to perform, and then that instance gets disposed. Now, you might ask if you need to implement IDisposable in this case. And my response is, of course, implementing IDisposable is useful in most of the situations. But in this pattern here, it is actually not required. Because what happens here is that this using construct will make sure that after this code block has executed, it will call the dispose method on the DB context instance, because we know we can only use here in the using only instances of objects that implement IDisposable. So we are sure by the time that we exit this code block that the dispose method of the DB-context will be called, and we can be sure that that specific DB-context instance will be actually disposed. So there is no real reason why we should implement IDisposable ourselves. Once again, this is only for this very limited approach. If you have some more complex scenarios, then you might need to implement IDisposable, but as I say, it's not mandatory in this case because this using will already take care and dispose the DB-context instances when we finish the work that we need to do. And that's basically it. Now I guess you should be ready to write production-ready Blazor server applications and use Entity Framework Core the right way in that, which will, believe me, save you a lot of pain and headaches with a lot of different errors or entities that are already tracked and errors that you cannot really define or find exactly out why they are generated. This happens always when you use DB-context instances that have a longer lifetime, and in Blazor Server this happens a lot since the scoped lifetime is actually scoped to the entire circuit of the application. If you find or if you think that this content was useful for you, please hit the thumbs up button. Share, of course, this content with your peers if you think that they might find it also useful. You can use your social networks, emails, whatever you see fit, and it would be highly, highly appreciated. If you have any questions, comments, ideas, anything that you would like to share, don't be shy and use the comment section of this video, and I will be really glad to get a discussion going. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.